Hey everyone, welcome back. UFC 297 just concluded, and it saw a new middleweight champion crowned in Dricus du Plessis. Man, not gonna lie, super impressed by du Plessis last night. I thought he looked great. His cardio was on point. He was mixing in the grappling well, and the grappling exchanges weren't really getting drawn out very long. Sean was able to work back to his feet in most of them, but he was the aggressor, right? He was the one changing and dictating where the fight was taking place. Super impressive from du Plessis. We saw Raquel Pennington win the Bantamweight title, right? But before I run through all these fights and we start talking about them in a little more detail, man, we got to talk about Frankie Edgar getting announced for the 2024 Hall of Fame class. Nobody more deserving, right? Frankie Edgar for a long time was one of my favorite fighters. I think honestly, just because we went to the same university, Clarion University, which a lot of people don't know about. It's this small university in northwestern PA. I don't know how many students on campus, on the main campus, maybe 7,000, 8,000, I think, when I was there at least. But Frankie obviously went way before me, and I didn't wrestle there, but he did. But people forget that these little schools in Pennsylvania, like Clarion, Edinburgh, they're sister schools. Josh Koscheck wrestled at Edinburgh, and Kurt Angle wrestled at Clarion. We also had, I can never remember his name, but there was this kid from, I believe it was Uzbekistan, when I was maybe a junior or a sophomore, probably a sophomore. And he went into the Olympics, and I think he won a bronze medal recently. I'd have to look that up to verify. But anyway, Clarion has a very strong wrestling program, right? And there was a massive upset in wrestling. I can't remember their names either. I don't follow wrestling closely enough. But in one of the lighter divisions where this kid lost, and the tournament took place at Clarion University. I think it might have been a high school kid. It was an open at Clarion, and I think he was going against I think his name was Spencer. I'd have to look it up. But anyway, strong wrestling roots at Clarion, and that's where Frankie went to school and wrestled at, right? So I always rooted for him throughout my college career, right? The time that I spent at college. So nobody more deserving, right? Always undersized for the 155-pound weight class. When he fought BJ Penn, I mean, Frankie is not a big guy, and you saw later in his career that he dropped down to bantamweight, and you can't tell me that it's easier to get to bantamweight when you're getting into your mid-30s than it would have been when you were in your late 20s, right? Like Frankie always probably should have been down a weight class or two lower, and he did eventually get, down to featherweight and all that, but to win the title Frankie was a bad motherfucker in his prime. Frankie just boxed your face off, wrestled you, constantly active with the ground and pound. I mean, his style was very simple, but very effective, and he just never got tired, and he never gave up on himself. And there's never been a fight, still one of my favorite fights of all time, more evident of that, or like exemplifies that more than his second fight against Gray Maynard, when he was hurt bad in the first and second round. But he recovered, right? He came back, and then they fight to a draw. He goes on to finish Gray Maynard in their next fight. But that second fight is one of the most legendary fights of all time. Up there in the top 5 of my favorite fights, up there with the likes of Rory McDonald versus Robbie Lawler. An amazing fight, and just a testament to his willpower and his heart. He was the fucking man, and I was so happy to see him get inducted into the Hall of Fame last night. Super happy for Frankie Edgar. He's first ballot, no doubt. If there's ever a guy more deserving, I mean, it's Frankie Edgar. I think he exemplified everything that fighting was about early on. Like I said, I just love the style. I love this tenacity. I love this heart. And he isn't the most outspoken guy in the world. Never drew a lot of attention to himself, but his personality came out in his fighting. And I think that's what I always loved about Frankie. So super happy to see him get into the Hall of Fame. And I think the actual induction will be in June. So congrats to him. One of the greatest and probably most underappreciated fighters of all time. Honestly, I mean, I love Frankie Edgar, if you guys cannot tell, right? But I wanted to make sure we talked about that a little bit before moving on. And another thing that I want to touch on just before we get into the fights themselves is, again, I hate to be critical, but what is up with Cruz's commentary, man? What is going on there? I think that by nature, he's a bit of a contrarian. And I've talked about this with my wife on several occasions. I think that when he is watching a fight, oftentimes he analyzes it as if he is losing and what would he do in that situation. So for example, in the Khabib versus Conor fight, you'll notice that he talks a lot about Conor conserving energy. And then Joe has to kind of bring him back to center and be like, no, he's getting mauled right here. Khabib's holding him down, beating him up, and Conor can't do anything about it. You know, and I think that Cruz is looking at it like, if I was in that situation where things are getting bad, what would I do? And I think that sometimes he presents this like argument that is not really like portraying what's actually happening in the fight, if that makes sense. Like, he's looking at the possibilities of what could be happening based on his winning mentality and what he would do if he was the loser in those circumstances. And he's trying to see it from both perspectives. And I think by nature, he draws in to the losing perspective and thinks, oh, but if I was down like this, I would be conserving energy. Like, okay, I got taken down, no big deal. I'm going to be patient, get back up. But it's like, but okay, that's not what's happening. And I think he falls into that a little bit, but he'll kind of latch on to narratives. And we saw this last night where he latched on to this narrative of damage. Like, he had mentioned it several times throughout the card. If you guys were listening to the commentary and like paying attention to the earlier fights, he just kept talking about, he's like, oh, if you get a cut, man, that's it. You know, the round's gone. And it's like, that's not true whatsoever. And he latched onto this narrative before John Anik finally corrected him. And he's like, well, the judges aren't supposed to be looking at the faces and as an indicator of damage. And this brings up an important point. I thought it was important that Anik eventually corrected him, even if it was during the main event. Like, maybe that should have happened a little sooner. But I don't know. It's tough because, like, you got to respect Dominick Cruz's opinion. He's one of the greatest of all time. Like, when it comes down to bantamweights, I still think that I think he still has the best resume of all time. I still think Dominick Cruz is the GOAT in the bantamweight division. But it is just odd sometimes how he does do stuff like that. Like, he gets on these, like, he's like contrarian by nature a little bit. Like, it's almost like he's trying to disagree with the commentators. And there's not the same chemistry as when, like, Joe's on the mic. I'm just being honest, man. Like, I've been critical of Dominick Cruz before, like when he, like, called out Keith Peterson for smelling like alcohol and cigarettes after he stopped the Henry Cejudo fight. And again, I don't know. I commentating would be hard. But there's just this friction when he's in the booth with these guys, it feels like, that's not present when other people are doing the commentating. And it feels like Cruz has rubbed, like, there's like instances, I feel like, with Felder, Bisping, DC, like almost everybody. You know what I mean? He has this like weird, I don't know. And maybe that's good for the broadcast overall. Maybe it's good that people like me are talking about it and talking about how he brings this different style and stuff to the commentary. But overall, I don't know. I think it would flow. It flows a little bit better when you got guys like, you know, Bisping or Joe, DC, and Anik is obviously the like everybody's favorite commentary team. I really like Bisping. I think that Bisping gets, like, you know, off topic a little bit sometimes, but I like Bisping. I think he calls the fights well, and I think he gives you a good perspective on what's happening. He razzes like Brendan Fitzgerald all the time. I like Bisping a lot, but man, and it's not that, like, there will be times during the fight. I'm being critical of one aspect of Cruz's commentary, so I want to be fair here and make sure that I give him credit where it's due. Like I said, he's one of the greatest bantamweight, in my opinion, of all time. But he will pick up on things in the fight that I would never, ever see, right? Like, he will pick up on patterns and things that people are doing, and he always comes into the fights very well educated on what the fighters are doing. I mean, he knows them inside and out. He just sometimes takes this weird perspective on the fights. But in terms of the technical stuff, what's going on in the fight, Cruz is amazing at that. Right? I'm not saying that Cruz needs to, like, be taken out of the UFC broadcast. I'm saying, like, he's just got to learn to go with the flow a little bit more, I think, right? And not, like, get hung up on these certain things. But anyway, moving on. Just wanted to point that out. I thought it was odd. I think that Cruz is a good commentator. I think he understands what's going on in the fights. But like I said, I think he just gets, like, weirdly misguided sometimes. But anyway, let's move on. What else did I have written down here to talk about? Nothing till really the main event. So let's run through the prelims here, go through the results, right? First fight on the card, Jimmy Flick versus Malcolm Gordon. I cannot find online quickly, I was just Googling it, whether, like, it's not explicitly mentioned in the headlines, whether Gordon retired. And I watched this fight, right? I saw Malcolm Gordon. He was doing really well. I thought he was going to go on to win the fight. I mean, he was dominating Jimmy Flick in the first round, then just made a mistake, got taken down, gave up his back, and immediately got choked out once Jimmy Flick got there. So, great performance from Flick, by the way. Way to weather the storm a little bit. And again, talking about that concept with Frankie Edgar earlier of not giving up on yourself, Jimmy Flick didn't do that, right? And he choked out Malcolm Gordon. And I saw Gordon take the gloves off, but I was like, after the fight ended, I wasn't really listening to the interviews too much. Like, I'm doing other things. It's the prelims. Like, no offense to these guys. Like, I watched the fight, but then I'm not listening to everything they say on the mic. I'm like cooking dinner and shit, or whatever I'm doing at the time. So, didn't catch what he said. So if any of you guys know if Malcolm Gordon officially retired, please let me know in the comments. I believe that he did. I don't know if he was given the camera time for that. Who knows? Right? Jasmine Jasudavicius versus Priscilla Cachoeira. Man, this was one of the most dominant performances, honestly, in like UFC history, I feel. There was a 10-7 round scored by one of the judges, I think the second round, and Jasmine just dominated her from bell to bell. I believe the total strikes landed by Jasmine was 228 and only 4 by Priscilla, right? So super dominant from Jasmine. Very impressive performance. But I hate to say this, man, and we're going to get into this. Actually, let's just talk about it now while we're on the topic of women's MMA, right? I feel like I'm being hypercritical this episode. Like, I just criticized Dominic Cruz, and now I'm about to criticize the talent in some of the women's divisions. But unless you are elite, right, there's not a whole lot going on that's exciting about especially in particular, I want to talk about the Bantamweight division, right? And let's save it. Let's save it for the end, right? I'll keep going through these prelims, and when I get up to the Pennington versus Silva fight, we'll talk about the state of the 135-pound division in particular, right? But just on the same topic, before we move on, there are dominant performances in the UFC. Sometimes they happen. Sometimes a person really does just get 10-9, 10-8, 10-8 from bell to bell, right? Like, they just get dominated. It happens. But this was a huge mismatch, right? The odds indicated it, and then the outcome obviously proved it. It's like fights like that, I don't think it just kind of tells you where things are at, right? And I don't know, it's rare that you get I feel like it's so rare that you get a super competitive war in the women's division, especially on these earlier fights. It happens, don't get me wrong, but I don't know. Let's move on. Sam Patterson versus Johan Lainez. Sam Patterson got a rear naked choke win here. I might do a breakdown on this one, right? Take a closer look at it, so stay tuned for that. I'll take a look and see if there's enough going on with it to break down. Jillian Robertson picked up a nice win over Poliana Viana. Ramon Tavares versus City. I keep wanting to call him Sidey, but it's City. This one was a little bit controversial, right? But Tavares was landing some bigger shots. I thought he had the more impactful shots throughout this fight. City has some work to do on his defense, I think, but he did do a good job with his offense, right? You can tell that he holds range and stuff well, just getting stung and countered when he would, get a little bit irresponsible on the way in. So he's got to clean that stuff up, learn to use his length to his advantage a little bit more, and maybe get out a little more quickly. But good fight. Thought it could have gone either way. I don't think you can get too upset with the decision on this one. Woodson versus Charles Jourdain. Man, if you are Charles Jourdain, if you guys don't know, this fight was announced, and if you listen back to it, you can tell that Bruce Buffer did say Sean the Sniper Woodson, right? But in real time, for some reason, it sounded like, I think Bruce did start saying Cha. He was like Sean. I think he said Sean as opposed to Sean. I think he said Sean the Sniper Woodson. And when you hear that, Charles thought he won. Put his hands up, was all excited. DC comes in, they straighten things out, and he goes, Woodson won the fight. And Jourdain's like, fuck. And then Woodson's like, oh, shit, I won. You know what I mean? Like, crazy. But to me, and Sean Woodson thought the same thing, and Jourdain thought the same thing. And I in the audience thought the same thing. I thought he was going to say Charles just by the way he started. Like, I don't know. Very interesting. It was a weird situation. But Woodson ultimately picked up the win. I thought that was the right call, right? I thought Woodson was really dotting Jourdain up. Jourdain just had a hard time getting on the inside and landing those shots. Woodson is a problem, man. Jourdain was a relatively big favorite coming into this one. I think he was at like minus 160 to minus 190 somewhere maybe. I don't know. I can't remember. But Woodson is a problem, man. He's really hard to take down. It's really hard to get both of your hands around his legs because his frame is so long. Like, who's built like that? There's no one built like Sean Woodson in the rest of the UFC. His legs are so fucking long. He can just like spread them out, and it makes it so hard to wrap both of your hands around to get to the double leg. And then getting to the single leg, if you get there, even if you manage to elevate the leg a little bit, he's got his post, right? His hips are so high off the ground, and he's able to post and move like it's nearly impossible to take the dude down. It's crazy. I feel like you got to really smash his knees together, right? My professor actually was just talking about this concept when you're passing a bigger guy's guard of like, boom, keeping their knees smashed together, right? So, yeah, very, very, very interesting body style. And he's a problem, man. He's got good hands too. He's very smooth with his boxing. Garrett Armfield versus Brad Katona. Man, I'm a Brad Katona fan. I think that he mixes things together well, but Armfield was just dotting him up. Like, I think this style for Katona was really difficult to deal with because Katona doesn't have a lot of reach and range with his punches. And when he boxes, he almost pulls up short on a lot of his punches, right? Like, he's hooking and his hooks are all like here. Right? He doesn't really extend out a whole lot. And I think every time he did feel like he had to overcommit or to get to Armfield, that's when he was countering. And Katona had you got to give credit to Armfield. Armfield had a really good lead hand working throughout this fight. His lead hand was working so well, and I think Katona had a really hard time getting past it, and he was getting stung. Every time he tried to close off the distance, could never really get in on any of the takedown attempts. It was a good performance from Armfield, man. I was super impressed with his ability to counter and just, again, use that lead hand, super educated lead hand. He gave Katona fits the entire fight. Moving on to the main card, Movsar Evloev versus Arnold Allen. This one I think went how I kind of in my heart thought it would go. I thought Allen could win this fight, though. I picked Allen in this one. I thought that Allen would be able to stuff the takedown attempts and fire off with the boxing a little bit more. But you could see on the feet, man, Allen had moments, but he couldn't really get any offense going off against this guy. And I think that's a testament to how good Movsar is on the feet. I think his boxing is just very controlled, right? He uses kicks. He uses everything at his disposal. Right? And he just puts the pressure on you, man. And he's very defensively sound as well. He's a hard guy to hit, and the threat of the takedown is constantly there. And I worried about this going into the fight, but letting him around to your back and the mat returns and just constantly taking you down, it wears on you, man. And you could see Allen defended correctly early on. There was a point where he did like 3 Granby rolls in a row, but he could never break the grip of Evloev. And Evloev just, man, really impressive performance because I think Arnold Allen is really fucking good, right? Like, I think that you look at that Max Holloway fight and Max dotted him up. Like, Max kind of took him to school a little bit. But Allen kept trying, didn't give up on himself. He was landing shots of his own. I thought he had a strong 5th round. He finished the fight strong. He was trying to make adjustments. He's a competitor, man. And for Evloev to go out and do that to him, that was very impressive. Now, a bit of controversy in this fight too. Allen had him in this sort of like front headlock and had the arm trapped, right? And Evloev is backing up towards the cage. And well, more, I guess, Allen is running him back, right? But in the process of that, Evloev is reaching down and putting his hand on the mat so that he's a grounded opponent. Now, I don't know the fucking rules, but I believe that it has to be weight bearing, right? From what I saw people posting on Twitter last night, if you guys want to take any credibility, right? Or give that any credibility rather. But with the hand posted, I think that as long as Allen, I don't think the hand should have to completely come off the mat. I think as long as Allen is taking the load off with those lifts up, he should be able to knee his opponent in the head. And also, I think the fact that you can just, don't get me wrong, I'm not in there doing this. I don't want to fucking get kneed in the head. But if you're talking about the reality of fighting and the reality of getting to a dominant position like this one, I don't think that you should just be able to stick your hand down on the mat and then that's a safeguard from this dominant position. Like, I don't think that should really, I think one has a really good rule set, right? Like, I like that they allowed knees to down opponents. Like, yes, it is brutal when it happens, but a lot of knockouts are, man. So is getting kicked in the fucking head, right? Like, look at how Joaquin Buckley knocked out Impa. I mean, that's one of the most brutal knockouts ever, right? And one of the most highlight reel-esque knockouts ever too. But I don't know. I just feel like the knees in that position should be legal. And when you got someone trapped like that you just took away a difference maker in the fight, right? Allen was finding success, got him to that position. And when you can start doing damage, and when you're someone like Allen, who really has the power to put you away, man, I kind of thought if you're Goddard in that situation, you let it ride. I don't know. That was my personal opinion, but I'm not in there. And I don't think that it was the wrong decision by Goddard. I think it's subjective a little bit weirdly. Like, I don't know. How do you determine what load bearing is, right? It almost is like you need a visual indicator, and the hand being cleared, space between the hand and the mat, if you look at it on video, right? Like, that is a very clear visual indicator, whereas how do you determine what load bearing is? There's a little bit more of an argument there. There's a little bit more leeway for that type of argument. So I don't know. I kind of think you let it ride. I don't know. I think that rule should just be changed entirely. I think they need to redefine what a grounded fighter is, or, I don't know, take away the ability for the person who's in that bad position to just put the hand on the ground to prevent it. Seems ludicrous to me, but whatever. Anyway, moving on. Chris Curtis versus Marc-Andre Barriault. This fight was very competitive, right? But I thought that Barriault was just going to fight a completely different style fight. I mean, this fight was a little bit boring, to be honest with you. They got after it and stuff a little bit at times, but more so towards the very end of the fight. But I think that Barriault should have turned this into a war. Like, he should have, don't get me wrong, Chris Curtis can fight in the clinch. Like, you saw that in these moments that, like I said, in the third round where they did start getting after it a little bit more. But Barriault is the type of person, in my opinion, right? My take on watching him fight, I feel like he puts guys up against the cage. He just stays in your face. He's constantly grabbing the back of your head, hitting you with elbows, hitting you with knees, just constantly working. And he might be losing in those situations. But when he gets into those types of fights, it wears on his opponents. He's able to weather so much damage. And I think they start finding success and thinking they're winning. And then he just never takes his foot off the gas and just keeps coming, right? And I thought we'd see a little bit more of that from Marc-Andre Barriault last night, and we didn't. But sometimes when you get in there against a guy like Chris Curtis, something to consider too is you just feel like, man, maybe that's not there. Maybe that's not available to me because of his stance, his presence, the way he feels in that moment, right? So it's hard to tell. But I think that if Barriault engaged in that type of fight or tried to push it a little bit more, he might have found success there. But again, he might have feared Curtis's ability to counter him and keep him from ever really closing that distance off early on in the fight. Because Chris Curtis has got some fucking hands, right? And he comes from that same camp as Strickland. They stay pretty defensively sound for the most part, man. But yeah, big win for Chris Curtis. Good win for him. Canadian men did not have a good night on this fight card. I think all of them lost, if I'm not mistaken. But same is going to be true in this next fight between Neil Magny and Mike Mallott. Mallott had Neil dead to rights. He beat him for 2.5 rounds, and then he allowed Neil to get up on top. And once Neil got to mount, Mallott could not escape. And Neil Magny is a veteran, right? And people are saying like he got fraud checked, and I'm not going to say fraud checked. I think though, if you look at Neil Magny's career, I know he's getting a little bit older, right? I think he's 36, right? It's not like he's 40. And say what you want, Neil Magny, if you're not ready for the leap into the elite level of the UFC welterweight division, Neil Magny will snuff you out. Like, he will determine whether you're ready to make that leap next, right? If you can't get past Magny, you're going to have a hard time climbing the rest of the ladder when you start getting into that top 15. And again, last night showed you that, man. Mallott had a hard time with him, just was able to dominate him for most of the fight, but could never get him out of there. And Magny weathered the storm, got on top, and won in the final 20 seconds of the fight. I mean, again, Mallott just has things to work on. And when you're dominating someone like that, you want to see the person be able to get to a finish, right? And that's why letting it go the distance is dangerous, especially against someone like Neil Magny, who does have so much experience, right? It's like you gotta work to try to get the guy out of there. And I don't think that I just don't think that also, I just think Magny's defense is really good as well. But if you look at like what Burns did to Magny, despite Magny's ability to retain a good guard and get his hooks in, and he's constantly moving for underhooks and stuff, he makes things rough on you when you're on top. Gilbert was able to get through within a round and get to the arm triangle once he got them out. It's like, if you get there against somebody as good as Magny, you got to get him out. Like, you can't give him opportunities for the opening. You know what I mean? Mallott just burned out, man. So kind of disappointing. I'm sure that's got to be a tough win for him, or a tough loss for him, rather. Tough loss to take, but he's got to go back to the drawing board and get better from that and realize, like, okay, this is what it takes, man. Like, this is what that next jump into the top 15 is going to look like. And that's, to be honest with you, at the lower end of it. Like, once he starts getting into the top 10, top 5, top 3, I mean, you're talking about massive leaps up in competition. And Mallott's got to be, if he wants to get there, man, he's got to get his foot on the gas a little bit and, you know, start having some impressive performances coming up, because I think he's 32. It's like, if you're going to make this happen, you've got a 3-year run, and he's only got 13 professional fights to his name so far. And getting turned away by Magny is going to be tough. You're going to have to rebuild, get another matchup, win that fight, maybe get a fight in the top 15 after that. If you win there, maybe up into the title. Like, it's going to be a long road for him. So he's going to have to be active over these next 3 to 4 years if he really wants to make a run at the title. Just my opinion, obviously, like all of this is. But tough loss for Mike Mallott, and another contender turned away by Neil Magny, man. Every time I pick against Neil Magny, he wins. And every time I pick, I'm like, all right, he's gonna shut this one down. Like, he loses, man. So I don't know. I can never fucking pick his fights right. I feel like I was rooting for Magny last night. Like, he trains here in Colorado, right? Like, I wanted Magny to win, but I just thought that it would be a big moment for Mallott in Canada, and I thought that Mike would get it done. But Neil Magny, man, again, that concept we talked about earlier again with Frankie, never giving up on yourself. That's very evident in Neil Magny. Impressive performance from him. All right, Raquel Pennington versus Mayra Bueno Silva. I'm not going to lie. I don't even know what to really talk about in this one. I mean, there were some submission attempts. There were some boxing exchanges. But it was just boring, man. And the women's 135-pound division, I hate to be critical, right? Like, I don't want to sit here and, bash it. But the women's 135-pound division is in a weird spot. If the top representative of the level of talent for that division for the UFC is Raquel Pennington, man, they are going to have a tough time selling pay-per-views. And again, Raquel Pennington, I love Raquel Pennington. Like, she fights out of Colorado as well. I don't know her or anything, but great fighter. Like, she's really good everywhere. She's got really good boxing, good wrestling. Like, she's just well-rounded, man. But there was something about the fight that just lacked that sort of, that sort of feeling you get even in the 115 and 125 pound divisions, right? Like when fucking Zhang Weili's fighting, I'm excited. When Alexa Grasso is fighting, I'm excited, right? Valentina Shevchenko, I'm excited. And you got some contenders coming up like Erin Blanchfield, Manon Foyot, Chookagian's always there in the mix, right? Jessica Andrade, Macy Barber, Amanda Hebos, Tracy Cortez. They're exciting names in those lighter divisions. But now that Amanda Nunes is gone, the bantamweight division for women is just not, there's just no one in there that like gets you super excited. Irene Aldana has been looking good recently. I would say she's one of the most like exciting up and comers, but Nunes also just put such a stamp on the division, right? Like she already beat Irina, so it kind of leaves this shadow looming over the rest of the division that makes the contenders feel illegitimate for a while until a new dominant champion steps up to the plate. And I think 135 needs that. They need that like dominance in a young contender that's coming up through and people are like, oh, fuck, this girl is a problem. Like Tatiana Suarez, the way people think about her, they need someone like that at 135. And when I'm looking at the top 15 right now, man, I just don't think it's there. Like they need to get some real talent in there and do some fucking, I don't know, some hardcore scouting because the women's bantamweight division is all, and not that the women's division, just admittedly, and just being realistic, is always going to be a bit of a tough sell to headline a pay-per-view. It wasn't when you had someone like Ronda Rousey, who was a fucking megastar, but the UFC just doesn't have that in a woman, in the female champions right now, right? So they're always going to need a little bit of help, but I wasn't super excited for the fight last night, like for the co-main event last night. Like, I was more excited to watch Allen versus Evloev than I was Pennington versus Silva, just being honest. You know what I mean? I was more excited for all the fights on that card, more so than I was the title fight. And that's just not good if that's the best in the division. Like, if that's what your elite level talent looks like, if that's what the top of the heap looks like I said, it's just going to be hard to get people's eyeballs on these fights. But anyway, it was a bit boring, right? There were some moments of excitement, and Raquel Pennington becomes the champion. And we'll see what's next for. I don't know, probably Juliana Pena, right? That's a good fight. I'm interested in that fight, but it doesn't, I'm more excited for Yan Xiaonan and Zhang Weili coming up. Like, I'm just more excited in those, just feels like there's more going on in those divisions, and I think 135 is in need of talent. But, anyway, moving on. Let's talk about the main event. Dricus du Plessis wins the middleweight title from Sean Strickland. And he does so via split decision and a lot of controversy around this one. But this narrative that I keep seeing online about robberies, I think you got to be careful throwing that term around. I've talked about this before, but last night was not a robbery. You have to accept that when you leave a fight up to it's subject to what three people think about it. There's going to be controversy, right? But just because you thought that Sean Strickland won the fight does not mean that he won the fight. I think that Sean Strickland won the fight, but I can absolutely see an argument for Dricus being crowned the champ. I think that Sean, in my opinion, clearly won rounds 1 and rounds 5. And I think that Dricus very clearly won rounds 3 and 4. But 2 is up for debate, I think. I think that's the swing round. In my opinion, that was the swing round, right? I thought that's the one where I was like, man, felt that it could have gone either way. I thought Sean got it. He was working the jab well. I thought he landed like a little bit of the cleaner shots. I think du Plessis was missing with a lot of stuff at that point still. Got to the takedown, but Sean hit a nice switch and got back to his feet almost immediately. I mean, it just felt like Sean did a little bit more in that round to me. And I watched the fight back this morning, and I still felt that Strickland won. But that doesn't mean that there are people that felt that du Plessis won, right? And I understand that we see some bad calls and stuff, but when you're leaving it up to 3 people, that's bound to happen. I think there's a problem with how many judges there are. I think there's a problem with them being influenced by crowd noise. I think there's a whole bunch of problems with the UFC scoring system that could be addressed in a few different ways, right? But without getting into all that, du Plessis could have very easily won this fight. He was definitely the aggressor. He was constantly coming forward. He was the one mixing in the takedown attempts. Granted, he didn't do a whole lot with them, but he was the one on the offensive from the wrestling perspective. He was the one changing levels and dictating where the fight took place. That was all du Plessis, right? He was on the front foot most of the fight, like putting the pressure on Sean Strickland, right? And Sean was landing. His jab was working really well. I think he got away from the front kicks a little bit and from the right hand, especially in the third round. But I think that if he had thrown them front kicks out a little bit more, it would have made du Plessis a little bit more hesitant to keep closing off that distance and going for those big attacks. But this was a very competitive fight, about as close as a title fight gets. And I thought that it could have gone either way, and I don't think you can be disappointed with du Plessis winning this fight. And also, I keep seeing this argument online for Strickland that numbers don't lie. Numbers don't lie. Well, in a fight, I think they do, right? They can give you an idea of what's happening, but when I watch a fight, I'm a big believer in the eye test, man. And that's why fighting, when there's a problem with leaving it up to only 3 people, especially if there's 3 people, you feel like they don't know what's going on. That's going to undermine all of the integrity of judging, right? But I believe that it should remain it's a subjective sport. I don't think you should start counting numbers, counting the number of I don't believe in any of that. I think you watch the fight and you just know based on the criteria that they give you, like you can account for okay, I'm prioritizing damage over this, and that. You can do all that. But I'm a believer in the eye test. Just watch a fight. You can tell who's winning the fight sometimes, right? That's why I hate when people are like, oh man, Strickland, he outlanded him in this round. And that can be true, but du Plessis was throwing the bigger shots, throwing that head kick up there, throwing that kick to the body, right? Throwing leg kicks out there, even if he was checking a lot of them, Dricus was still the one throwing constantly. You know what I'm saying? It's like, it doesn't tell the story of the fight. And I think that claim is ridiculous. I don't think that we should. When I'm watching fighting, personally, this is what I'm doing. I think of it as a scale. And when one guy does something well, he's adding weight to that scale in my mind, and it starts tipping in his favor, right? And when the other person does something well, they're trying to balance it out, and then they hit a point where maybe they're here, and it's going back and forth. That's how I'm thinking about the fight, right? Like if Strickland, for example, he's landing, and then du Plessis lands a power shot, it's like, does Sean start getting back on the jab immediately? Does he start landing with that's how I'm thinking about it, going back and forth and back and forth. And the person who adds the most weight to the scale, they win the round, right? And then the difference between what this person did and this person did is how you differentiate between 10-9 and 10-8. That's how I've always thought of it, right? And I think that when you're looking at the second round, the scale is like this. And based on the things that you prioritize and the things that you think are more important in the fight, you're not going to eliminate all the bias, even if you know the scoring criteria. There's nothing wrong with this fight going to du Plessis. He went out and earned it. And we also have to talk about, man, he mixed his wrestling in really well, super technical, but how about his cardio? Because we've seen him get in these moments where he's never, I wouldn't say that he doesn't fade away, but he definitely starts to tire, right? Like he still keeps coming after you and throwing things, but there gets to be a little bit more sloppiness in his technique. And we didn't really see that last night, man. I mean, granted, he does throw unorthodox punches, but I was really impressed with his composure and his ability to keep pushing a pace all the way through the fight. Really impressive performance. And this begs the question, what's next for each of these guys? I think with Sean Strickland, he should maybe fight the winner of Robert Whittaker versus Paulo Costa. I think that would be a good fight, right? And I think that's coming up on the next pay-per-view, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know. There's been all these fight announcements. I'm mixing the cards up, so that could be incorrect. But I think that's an interesting fight. And for du Plessis, you got to wonder if they're wanting him and Adesanya or him and Alex Pereira at UFC 300, right? I would think that they're going to go with du Plessis versus Adesanya. And it's an interesting spot for Adesanya because he's going to get a fight against this guy who just won the belt from the guy who beat him. So for Izzy, he's in this situation where he's coming off a loss and he could potentially get a title fight just because these two guys do have history. And when you look at Izzy, I don't think I think that you've seen excuses that Izzy was not well prepared for the Strickland fight, da-da-da-da-da. I disagree with that. I think Izzy was looking really good early on in that fight, and Strickland eventually fucking started putting the pressure on, cracked him, and it changed the tempo of the fight from there. Izzy rebounded nicely in the second round, right? But then Strickland just kept coming. I think everything changed after Strickland landed that big right hand, and the shots of Strickland started to impact Izzy. You could see him kind of shying away from some of the shots a little bit at the end, towards the end of the fight. I mean, anyway, without getting too far into that, I just think that Israel Adesanya is in a rare position where even though he's coming off a loss, he could get an immediate title fight. Because at 185, who else is really there? Khamzat. There's an argument for Khamzat now, though. And you know what? I think that people would be very interested in seeing Sean Strickland if they do decide to go Dricus du Plessis versus Khamzat, strictly because Izzy is coming off of a loss. I don't hate Strickland versus Izzy again. I want to see if Izzy can make the adjustments to beat Sean. Because also, Sean looked like a world champion last night. So did Dricus du Plessis. But Sean looked like a world champion. He looked composed. He looked good. He kept you know what I mean? He fought behind a game plan. He came on heavy in the fifth round. I thought he won the fifth round. I thought he won the fight, but I thought he won the fifth round for sure. I mean, last night, Sean Strickland fought like a fucking champion. Dricus du Plessis just rose to that level. And I am super interested in seeing if Strickland can pull it off twice or if Izzy can make the adjustments and beat a guy like Strickland after seeing him, after feeling him, after watching this fight against Dricus. I think that's a good matchup. And if they want to go, like I said, Khamzat versus Dricus, do a fight like that, Strickland versus Izzy is a fight. That's a good fight. So we'll see. I don't know. We'll see what happens, but I would be interested in that if they did it personally. But that's going to wrap this one up, guys. I'm going to go down. We got to walk our dogs and all that stuff today. We got things going on this afternoon. I sprained my wrist at jiu-jitsu the other day, right? I can move it like a little bit in a circle. I'm trying to work mobility back into it. But I didn't train it all today, but I got to walk the dogs, get some of that stuff done. So anyway, I got responsibilities that I got to take care of, right? That I'm going to hop off here and go do. But thank you guys, as always, for tuning in. Much appreciated. I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.